welcome to Vision Voice Uganda. My name is Dr. Sumaru Charles Cake, and I'm right here to take you through the third session of the myth and misconceptions of what we call the mindset. So we started these classes a couple of Sundays ago, and the idea was to ensure that we help people get a clear understanding of what we mean by what we call the mindset. Yeah, we decided to go a little bit technical so that we can help people have a clear understanding of what you're trying to reach at, of what you're trying to understand. You know, because most of the challenges that we get in life, people always say, have a good mindset, have a clear mindset. Work upon your perception, work upon your conception. How do you balance stuff? If someone is broke or if someone is poor, someone says, okay, maybe you're poor because of a given mindset. If someone is not performing at a given kind of environment, they always accuse them of having what we call a poor kind of mindset. If a student is not performing well at class, we always go towards an attitude that probably you have an attitude about something. So it's because of this background that we're in position to say, okay, let's have a little bit of clarity or clear understanding of what we mean by what we call mindset. And this is our third program. Yeah, Vision Voice is a program where we come and we talk about personal development, career development, professional development, life science, and understanding exactly of how human beings react, interact, and respond to what we're experiencing as human beings at various fronts. Yes, to have a little bit of a recap, last Sunday, we're in position to talk about what we call the conscious and subconscious mind. And extensively, we were in a position to define the subconscious and the conscious mind and what brings about the difference. Yes, we started this class, the first class we talked about how humans perceive and how humans get information from the environment. So we said, oh, this is a mental game, or this is a mental game, or what we would call a cognitive activity. We are referring to cognitive abilities or cognitive activities that human beings get involved in. Yes, that's why we're a little bit in a position to say, okay, let's go into the brain so that we can have a clear understanding of what we are trying to achieve right here. So we started by talking about the brain, and we said that the brain is what each and every human being has. It is located, or it is placed in the head, and we said it is made up of cholesterol. It is made up of fats. Yes, we talked about that. We talked about the different levels of the brain. Yeah, we talked about what we call the brain hemispheres. I'm just trying to do a recap so that we can get into sync, or can get into synchrony of what you're trying to talk about here. We talked about the brain hemispheres. My producer Jaka can be in a position to bring it out. We talked about the brain hemispheres. We said that the human brain, all what we are talking about right here, is led or happens or takes place in the human brain. So that's why we talked about the brain hemispheres, the image that you're looking at right there. We said that the human brain is divided into two halves. The word hemisphere means half. We talked about the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain, and all of them operate in given ways. So we say each one of us has a given type of hemisphere that they use more than the other. By the time a human being is 12 years, there is a given part of the hemisphere that works more than the other. So we say that there are people who are so much gifted at using the right side of the brain, meaning that they are gifted in art and awareness, they are gifted in creativity, they have a very high sense of imagination, their intuition is so high, they are very insightful, they have holistic thought, music awareness, 3D formats, and in most cases, they are so much powerful when it comes to using the left hand control. And then we also talked about the people that are so much empowered naturally when it comes to using what we call the left side of the brain, that is very analytical, logical, good at language, reasoning, math, writing, numbers, and skills. Now we said all our hemispheres work. In other words, by the time you get to 12 years, all these hemispheres are a little bit very developed. But each one of us has a side of the hemisphere that they work on, that they use more than the other. Yes, we're just having a recap. If you really need to understand this, you can go to our YouTube channel, TV1 Uganda. That class was there. We had a little bit about it. You can go back and understand that. But we said that all these hemispheres work in human beings. In other words, we don't have only one hemisphere that works All of us use all these hemispheres, but I emphasize that by the time you're 12 years, one side of the hemisphere works more than the other. Then from there, we also talked about what we call the brain waves. Now, we say that, yes, the brain is divided into two hemispheres, but it also has what we call the brain waves. Yes, a little bit of the brain waves. I'm just doing a recap. The lower part of the brain waves is referred to as delta waves. We say that how does the brain pick up on waves? The brain picks up on waves because that's how information comes in. The information comes in. Now, the level or the rate at which these brains are moving, or the frequency I'm referring to the distance between a wave and a wave, or what we call an amplitude. In other words, when the brain is taking in so much or too much information at a very, very fast pace, the brain is operating at what we call gamma waves. And we said gamma waves, this is when the brain is experiencing positive experiences. Like, for instance, you've been looking for the money and then you've gotten it. You've been supporting football for the last 23 years. Arsenal has never covered, it has never won a Premier League. Now, that kind of excitement that you receive or that you experience, the brain receives it as what we call gamma waves. Then we also talked about what we call beta waves. Beta is when the brain is moving very fast, but when you are stressed. The brain is moving very fast in beta, but you are very, very stressed. In other words, you're picking up information, but the brain is very stressed. That's what we call beta waves. Then from there, we went into what we call theta waves. Now, theta is the third wave of the brain. We say that theta, this is when the brain is taking in a little bit of information, but the wave, the speed or the rate at which the information is being taken in, it is a little bit very, very slow. That's what we call theta. And then we say delta, that's the lowest level, or the lowest brainwave level. That is when the brain is moving very slow. And we say this one only always takes place when you are asleep. In other words, that's why you can get a dream and then you can't even recall what the dream was all about, because by the time the dream was taking place, you were a little bit of the unconscious. Then from there, we talked about what we call the human mind. Yes, which is our topic. And we talked about what we call the iceberg. The iceberg phenomena, this was something that was introduced by a gentleman called Sigmund Freud. Mr. Producer Jack, you can give us that image of the iceberg so that people can understand. Now, we said what we mean by the iceberg is, we used an example of the Titanic, that what you're conscious of as a human being is always at the tip. Now, where you see that upper part where there is conscious thoughts and perceptions, that is what we call the conscious bit of it. But the iceberg is always big downwards. In other words, what you look at is almost 5 or 10%, but the biggest part of the iceberg is always what is down. So what we call the conscious process, the consciousness is what you are aware of at that particular time, is what you are aware of at that particular time, what you get to understand, what you get to see, or what you get to know at that particular time. And then you can be in a position to get to understand that the lower part of the brain, or the lower part of what we call the human mind, is the biggest. And we say it is between 85 to 90%. We don't have cognitive abilities that happen at that level consciously. In other words, whatever happens underneath the conscious part, that is what we call the subconscious part of the mind. And when we say the mindset, we are referring to activities that take place at the conscious part of the mind and the subconscious part of the mind. So that's what we've been positioned to talk about extensively. You can look for the program on YouTube, on TV1 Uganda. We did those 2 classes. They're there. You can go in position and pick them up so that you can be in position to understand exactly when someone talks about mindset. It is not something that you just have to pick up in a minute or two. No, it's something very, very fundamental. And all these are what we call the mental games. In other words, as everything is taking place, the conscious and the subconscious minds are all operational, and you can get to understand. You can take away that picture, Mr. Jack, and look at what we were in a position to talk about last week. Now, we say the difference between the conscious and the subconscious mind is a little bit very big. We said that the conscious part of our mind is in position to produce almost 2 million activities, or 20 million activities, to 2 million activities, right, by the way, on a given in a given second. In other words, the conscious bit of our mind is very, very slow. And then we say that the subconscious part of our mind is very, very fast. That's why when you get an accident, and if you get any problem that is disturbing you, how you choose to react, you don't react from the conscious bit of it. No, the conscious bit of it is very slow. You have to process information such that you can get meaning out of that. And then this also takes us back to what we talked about when it came to the senses, the human senses. We say, how does the brain pick information? In other words, how do we get to what called the mind? So we say the brain is the biological organ that you have inside your head. And then the mind is whatever the brain gets involved in. In other words, the work of the brain is what we call the mind. Then we also talked about how the brain picks information up. The brain picks information from the environment using what we call the human senses. We talked about the sight, that is using the eyes. We talked about the nose for smelling. We talked about the skin, or yes, for feeling or for touching. We talked about the tongue for tasting, and we also talked about the ears for hearing. So we say the process of picking information from the environment where a human being is positioned, that is what we call perception. In other words, perception is when you choose to pick information, or the sensory picking up of information from the environment. That's what we call perception. And then from perception, we also talked about what we call conception. We said when the brain perceives from the environment, the process of making sense out of what you've been in position to perceive, that is what we call conception. So we said perception is what we pick from the environment, but conception is the mental breakdown of what you've been in position to perceive or to pick from the environment. When the brain engages in the process of making it down, breaking it down, such that you can reach a compromise, or such that you can reach a final conclusion of what you've been in position to perceive, that is what we call the conception. Now, the difference between perception and conception is that. Then we also talked about what we call that besides the five senses of hearing, tasting, smelling, there are also some other senses of how human beings pick up information from the environment. Then we call them extrasensory perception. We say that there are senses that enable human beings to pick information from the environment without us being consciously involved. This is when we talked about telepathy. This is when we talked about clairvoyancy. This is when we talked about retrospection, introspection, clairvoyancy. We talked about telepathy, and then we talked about what we call a precognition. A little bit of that. Telepathy is when you read someone's mind. Like, for instance, your wife or your mom is at home, and then she thinks about you, and then you also pick up a call, or you pick up a phone to call her at the same time. That's what we call telepathy. Or you are thinking about someone at that particular time, and then that person calls you. You know, people always say that speaking of the devil, are you just talking about someone? That very person appears from nowhere. That's what you call telepathy. In other words, you get into a position of perceiving or getting information when at mind level. Telepathy, if someone is very well trained, they can be in a position to influence people's minds. In other words, it's like you see something, you predict something at that very time, and you influence someone's mind to act the way you want them to do. Now, we do all these subconsciously, but if a human brain is trained, you can get to that level of doing that. That is what we call telepathy. Then we talked about what we call precognition. Now, pre means before. The cognition means understanding of the brain. Now, the experiences that we get in as human beings, but it's like before something happens, you try to experience it before. Now, that's what we call a precognition. It's like a premonition. Premonition is like when you have a negative experience, a nearly death experience, and then after that very experience comes in. Precognition is somehow related to what you call deja vu. In other words, a sense of familiarity. But by the time something happens or something occurs, you already have a preconceived or a predetermined kind of experience on how it's going to happen or how it's going to take place. That's what we call precognition. Now, from telepathy to precognition, and then there's what we call retrocognition. Now, retrocognition is when retrocognition is the opposite of precognition. Now, retrocognition is when something happens, then after some time, you get to understand it. Now, something can happen without you being consciously involved, right? But after you taking off some time, you're like, I had thought about this, Somehow, somewhere. It's like you experience something when you're not conscious of the present, right? But after some time, what you experienced makes sense after some time. That is what we call retrocognition. From precognition, retrocognition, telepathy. Telepathy is the level of influencing the mind. Now, all these are happening at what we call the subconscious part of the mind. So we say the conscious part of the mind is where thinking takes place, is where action takes place, is where dreaming takes place, aspirations, and all that. Whatever you're thinking about right now, whatever you think that you want to do, whatever you think that you can do in terms of a dream, in terms of an inspiration, in terms of you aspiring to get something done, that happens at what we call the conscious part of the mind. Then what happens at the subconscious part of the mind? We say those are the habits, those are the emotions, and those are the patterns or the behaviors that we so much tend to get involved in. Yes, that's what we talked about last week. You can go TV1 Live Uganda on YouTube and pick up that conversation so that we can get to do what we are supposed to do today. Now, today, we are going to talk about the activities that happen between the conscious and the subconscious mind. Now, we want to talk about what we call defense mechanisms, or what we call them defense mechanisms, or you can call them mental biases. Now, when we are talking about the brain, we said that the brain has 3 levels. Those that were with us last Sunday, we said that the brain has what we call the neocortex, which is 40% in the human brain. We said it is 20% in apes, 17% in dogs, and almost 3% in cats. We talked about what we call the frontal lobe or the neocortex. Now, that is the executive center of human activity mentally. That is what we call the neocortex. It's the executive part of the brain. It's the executive part of the mind. So from the neocortex or the frontal lobe, we talked about what we call the mammalian brain or the chemical brain. We said the chemical brain, this is the seat of emotions. That's where love, fear, ecstasy, bliss, excitement, hatred, envy, jealousy, all those anxiety, panic, stress, depression, all those emotions, they experience at what we call the second level of the brain, what we call the mammalian brain, the chemical brain, or the emotional brain. Now, the neocortex, which is the 40% of the human brain, it is bigger in women, it's bigger in men rather, and smaller in women. That's why it's a little bit easier for a man to follow a pattern. That's why it's very easier for a man to plan. That's why it is very easier for a man to follow a given dream and they achieve it. I'm not saying that women don't, but there is a little bit of some edge that men have beyond more than women. That is because of what we would call the bigger part of the neocortex, which is 40% of the human brain, and we say it is the executive area, executive part of the human brain. It is 40%. So we said the neocortex is bigger in men and smaller in women. That is the uppermost level of the brain. Now, the second level is what we call the emotional brain. Like I've just said, it is where love, fear, stress, ecstasy, bliss, envy, anxiety, panic, stress, disappointment, worry, sadness, love. That part is bigger in women than in men. Now, that's what we call the emotional brain or the chemical brain. And then the lower part of the brain is what we call the reptilian brain. Now, the reptilian brain is that part that sits down at what we call the brainstorm. At what we call the brainstem. Now, what's the role of this part? Now, the role of the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain is what controls the activities, the physiological activities of the brain. Like, for instance, I am seated down right here, but I am breathing in and out. Without oxygen, I can't breathe in and out. Now, that's the role of the reptilian brain. Now, when a human being is walking, as you're doing your walks and all that, that is the reptilian brain taking action. The reptilian brain is the smallest, but there's no difference between the reptilian brain of a human being and almost the reptilian brain of over some other mammals. With so much, that's why it is more of an animal part in us in terms of as human beings. That's why you refer to it as the reptilian brain, because it's like the reptile in a human being, most especially because of how it helps us survive. But I've just said it is what controls the physiological activities of the body. That is breathing in and out, what we would call respiration, the digestive process of the brain, and all other activities that are responsible for keeping the human body functioning as the way it's supposed to be functioning. That is what we call the reptilian part of the human brain. Yes, so we say that the neocortex, that's where thinking, decision making takes place. The emotional brain, that's where emotions are. And then the reptilian brain, which is the lowermost part, that is where the physiological activities like thinking, breathing in and out, walking, locomotion, all those activities are controlled at what we call the reptilian part of the brain. Now, let's look at the differences between the conscious and the subconscious part of the mind. I've just said that if you're watching this program for the first time, it will be a little bit hard for you to grasp what we're talking about, but the programs that we've been doing are on YouTube channel, TV1 Uganda. You can go in positions like that you can be in sync with us as we're moving forward. Now, let's talk about what we call the biases. Now, what we call the mental biases. I just wanted us to see how we process information. For your information, like we said last week, a human brain processes almost 20 to 70,000 thoughts per day. That's what the conscious brain can process. You process between 20 to 70,000 thoughts per day. Now, but these thoughts are almost the same. What you thought about yourself yesterday and what you're going to think about yourself tomorrow, they are the same patterns. Now, why does the brain get into a little bit of serious patterns? Last time we talked about habits. How do habits get involved? How do habits get formed? It starts with what we call a thought, right? We said from a thought to a feeling, from a feeling to an action, from an action to a habit, from a habit to an attitude, from an attitude to a character, from a character, a personality. In other words, most of the things that we do as human beings, we are creating who we are. A human being, or what you call a personality, is a combination of the thought, a feeling, an action, habits, character, and then you form what you call a personality. Because how do we get to understand someone's personality? Human personality is formed between 16 and 18 years. So that's why even when you are dealing with the legal kind of perspective, how do you define someone's consent? By the time a human being is 18 years, they can consent. You know why? Because their personality is formed. In other words, if someone gets into an activity or chooses to get into given kind of behavior by the time they are 18, I'm not saying that they are perfect. I'm saying that they've perfected this sometime. I mean, for quite some time. So that's why we said that it starts with a thought. You think about something. When you think about something, that is from the executive part of the brain, or what we call the neocortex, right? When you process it in a positive way, the second level of the brain, what we call the emotional brain, is going to send you positive emotions or positive neurotransmitters. One of the positive neurotransmitters we talked about last Sunday is what we call dopamine. Now, we say dopamine is only released in a human system through only two ways. Number one, when you eat food and even when you have sex. Those are the only natural ways of how dopamine can get so much released into the bloodstream, into the neurological stream of a human being. It is when you eat something, I mean something organic, right? When you put in something organic, the neurotransmitter, that's a dopamine, is going to get you rewarded. Why does it get you rewarded? It gets you rewarded, okay, it's what we call a reward center. It is because the brain wants to drag you into what we call a pattern kind of approach. Why do we get into a pattern kind of approach? Because the role of the brain, like we said, is to conserve energy. Now, the human brain was not designed to help you become successful. It wasn't designed to help you go where you want to go. The role of the human brain is to conserve energy. Now, when it comes to conservation of energy or energy conservation, anything that disturbs the brain is going to form what we call shortcuts. I was giving an example that you cannot go for a short call and then go for a long call at the same time. Why? Because the brain has to consider what is the most important activity that we need right now. If it's urinating, you urinate, but you can't do a long call, you can't make a long one and a short one at the same time. Why? Because the brain, like we said, it has two hemispheres. The brain hemispheres we talked about at the beginning, in between there is what we call an X, we call it the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is what brings up a little bit of how brain energy is supposed to be balanced, right? Whatever you consider important in your life, that is what is going to take more energy. Whatever you consider less important, that is what is going to take less energy. I gave an example last time, and I said in most of the schools, when you were also still studying, we always had issues to do with lunch, that after lunch, most of the students doze in classes, and the issue always was, or the blame always went to what you call posho and beans. Now, posho and beans might be a contributing factor, but the biggest factor that you have to look into is when the body takes in food, that is posho and beans, after lunch. Now, the brain has to process. Now, the teacher is teaching maybe math, maybe geography, maybe another subject that they are teaching, right? Now, to the teacher or to the school, what they think is more important is for the student to pay attention, such that they can listen to what the teacher is saying. But to the body, that's not what is most important. To the body, what is most important is the process of breaking down the posho and the beans that you put into your system, right? And in order to do that, the brain has to look for all sources of energy. Now, the brain has to look for all sources of energy, all energy sources, all energy centers. It's going to pick all, it's going to go and pick energy from all energy centers such that your body can be in position to contain all activities that are required. That's why after lunch, because the brain doesn't think that you looking at the teacher is very important, the brain is going to reduce on the type of energy or amount of energy that they are going to send to the human eyes. Now, this is going to be interpreted by dozing, by dragging a student into a dozing mode. Now, they are dozing. Why? Because too much, so many activities are taking place inside, right? And they cannot take place when the eyes are open. Why? Because we said almost 80% of the information that we take into the human brain go through the human eyes. Even when you look at the structure of the brain, almost 50% of the human eye, they are connected to the human brain. If you open up and look into the entire human center, mental center, brain center, the brain is too much connected to the human eye. That's why I said almost 80 to 85% of all the activities, all the information, or what you call the sensory perception that the brain takes in, go through the human eye. Now, that makes the sight very important. So when the food is being broken down, one of the activities where they have to get energy from is seeing. So the brain is going to be like, we need to cut off the sight such that we can use this energy to break down the food. For digestion to take place, a student has to doze. Not because they are not interested in in what the teacher is teaching, but according to the brain, that is not so important. What is more important is the process of breaking down the food. Now, the student is going to doze, and the teacher is going to say that probably the student is not that so much actively involved. Yes, they are not actively involved because according to the brain, there is something that is more important. Something that is more important than the math, than the history, than whatever subject you're teaching, and that is the digestive process. Now, that's what we call those are some of the areas. That is the interplay of the conscious and the subconscious part of the mind. So we said how the brain does that is by controlling what we call energy. Energy of the brain is transformed from what we call the adenosine triphosphate, what we call ADP, to what we call adenosine triphosphate, ATP. ATP is like the airtime of the body. I think I will give you an example here. You cannot use the same line. To make more than 2 phone calls. You cannot call Jack and call Kebros at the same time. What you can do, maybe you can put them on conference, right? But in order to call Jack, you have to put Kebros on hold, such that you just had them on the conference. Now, that's how the brain operates. You cannot use the same SIM card to call 2 people at the same time. The brain can't do that. Right? It can't do that. That's why you can't walk with all your legs moving forward at the same time. For the left leg to go forward, the behind leg has to be behind. The right hand leg has to be behind. Right? That's how we operate as human beings. We operate in what you call the binary system. That's why we have 2 brain hemispheres. That's why we have 2 ears. That's why you have 2 eyes. That's why we have 2 arms. It's a little bit of that is divided into the entire system. So just like I've just told you that you can't use the same SIM card to call 2 people at the same time, right? If you want to talk to Jack, that means you have to shut up That means you have to end the call of calling Kerberos, or you can just put Kerberos on hold and then you connect and then you retry the call. That's how the brain also operates. Now, because of that, the brain gets into what we call the biases. Now, what are biases? What we call an identity, or what we call a belief system or an attitude, is what we have as human beings. I am a man, I define myself like I'm an African man, right? So anything that does not agree with me, anything that does not accept what I believe I am, the brain is going to fight it. Any kind of interaction that I get involved in, and according to my brain, it is not the right one, my brain is going to fight it. My brain is going to respond in a way by coming up with what we call the bias. So what's the we're going to talk about what we call cognitive biases, such that we get to understand the interplay between the conscious part and the unconscious part of the mind. Why do we get biases? I told you, the cognitive part, the conscious part of the mind rather, the conscious part of the mind is very, very fast, right? But very fast in the conscious being. When you're paying attention to something, that is the conscious part. But when it comes to activities where there is fear, where there is protection, where there is a defense mechanism, the subconsciousness with the subconscious part of the mind can come and override the activities of the consciousness. Now, we say the conscious is very fast, but when it comes to danger, we don't protect ourselves from the consciousness, because the conscious part of your brain is a working memory. Because the conscious part of your brain is only 5%. It is very weak. It can't protect you. Right? In order to protect yourself, you have to close or to shut down the activities of the conscious, and then the subconscious part takes over. But remember, in order for you to understand how the subconscious protects you or protects the brain from danger, there are so many ways. You need to understand what is made up of the conscious part of the mind. The subconscious part of the mind, rather. We say the subconscious is where emotions are. We say, and that part is bigger in women than in men. You have to understand where the subconscious part of the mind is and what it is made up of. It is made up of emotions, it is made up of habits, and it also made up of attitudes and philosophies and what you call an identity. Now, the moment you get into danger, the conscious part of you is going to stop, and the subconscious part of you is going to come forward. Remember, we said the subconscious is almost 95%. When you look at the iceberg, the subconscious is what is down. It is faster. We said for it, it processes almost 4 million activities per second. It is the biggest, just like you're looking at what my producer Jack has been in position to put up. That's why it is very instinctive. It operates, it reacts out of instincts. It acts out of memory. It is where storage knowledge is. Why? Because that's a definition of who you are. You define yourself by amassing a lot of information, a lot of experiences about you from what we call the subconscious part of the mind. Now, I was talking about the interaction between the conscious and the subconscious. The conscious and the subconscious interact using 3 means. Number 1, it interacts using what we call cognitive biases. 2, it interacts using what we call classical thinking. There are 4 ways of classical thinking. And then it also interacts using what we call cognitive biases. Let's look at each of them so that you can understand what I am trying to tell you, to talk to you about. Let's start with the 4 methods of classical thinking. Now, when your brain experiences danger, what does the brain call danger? Right? What does the brain call danger? Now, you don't have to forget, this is a little bit of a connection. That's why I'm emphasizing that if you're just joining this discussion, first go to our YouTube channel and look at the conversations we first had. How does the brain consider? How does the brain pick up information from what is considered dangerous? Using the senses. Don't you ever forget that. The brain picks information using the senses, and that is what we call perception. And then we say the process of making sense from what has been perceived, that is what we call conception. Right? Now, when the brain experiences danger, your brain is going to react using 4 ways. Those are 4 methods of classical thinking. We call them 4 methods of classical thinking. Now, what does the brain consider danger? What the brain considers as something that is very cancerous or something that is very dangerous is what distorts your reality. Whatever is against you, whatever is against your reality, whatever is against your belief system, the brain considers it as danger. Now, there are so many belief systems, and we shall talk about how to develop belief systems, right? Now, what are the 4 ways how the brain protects you from danger? Number 1, the brain protects you from danger, number 1, by closing your eyes. Now, it's a little bit of very scientific, but I'm going to break it down. The first door, in other words, when the brain is attacked, when you are under attack, and by attack, I'm not talking about the physical self, I'm talking about the mental self. The mental definition of who you are. I'm not talking about your body parts, and I'm talking about who you consider yourself to be. That is who you are mentally, right? When that reality is distorted, when that reality is under attack, the brain is going to look for so many ways. It has 4 doors that it locks up, and the first door is what we call closing your eyes, or what we call sleeping. Now, have you ever been conscious enough to say that when a human being gets involved into a car accident and they hit seriously, the first thing they do is to become unconscious, like they close their eyes? Now that is the first door. Now this person not closing the eyes, why? Because it was so scary. They are closing their eyes because the brain is protecting itself from what it considers dangerous. Have you ever seen someone getting so much excited and they collapse? Someone gets so excited and they faint. Someone gets a surprise and they faint. Now that is your brain. Because what the brain considers dangerous, or protecting itself from what they consider dangerous, is any experience the brain has never had before. The first time it comes in, the brain is going to consider it dangerous. If your brain has never experienced anything before, whatever it experiences for the first time, it's going to consider it dangerous. Now, last week we talked about the brain neurons, and we said when the brain when the brain is learning something, it is a neuron and a neuron that come together and they connect. We call this a neural connection. But we say for the neural connection to happen, it takes place only, for neural connection, the connection, like you picked up something, right? Probably I've said something that you didn't know before, and now you're trying to make sense out of it, right? If your brain picks it, a neuron and a neuron are going to come together and they connect like this. That's what we call learning. Learning is making neural connections, right? But the connection that has taken place lasts for only 0.25 seconds. Now that's a little bit disturbing, but that's the capacity of the brain to retain. How do you ensure that the connection lasts forever and ever and ever? Is by doing something over and over and over and over again. The neural connection that I've just talked about, when a connection happens like this and takes place like this, it takes only 0.25 seconds. In other words, after finishing, by the time I finish one sentence, the connection that has come together, it is now disconnected. Now, the connection is what we call learning. The disconnection is what we call forgetting. I don't know if you're trying to follow what I'm trying to say. Now, that's why when the brain is experiencing something new, something it has never experienced before, the moment it experiences it, it's going to treat it's going to react to it as a dangerous experience, right? So that's why it is going to go for the first door. So the human brain experiences. Now, if what I'm teaching, if what I'm sharing with you is a little bit making you get a little bit crazy or get a little bit dozy, that is the first time the brain is experiencing this. Whatever the brain considers dangerous, it's going to tell you, it's boring. And the only way to show that is by closing your eyes. So the first door, or the first way the brain protects itself from danger is by closing your eyes. That's why sick people spend a lot of time in bed. Sick people spend a lot of time in bed. Why? Because seeing consumes a lot of energy. Seeing or the moment they keep on interacting more and more with their eyes, they are spending a lot of time, or they are engaging a lot of energy, right? That is a neurological experience. Because remember last time we said, any decision that you take as a human being, it takes in what you call the same neurological resources. In other words, the amount of energy you take to take a very big decision of investing maybe 50 million is the same energy you take to think about someone that you hate. We use the same forms of energy and the same brain levels. We don't have any capacity, not until when you develop what you call philosophies or belief systems. So the first door that helps our brain to protect ourselves from danger is by closing the eyes. That's why when people get into a car accident, all what they do first is they close their eyes. In other words, they become unconscious, or they faint, or they collapse for some time. After some time, the system regenerates, the system revamps. The system gets back again, and then this person comes back into the norm. Now, why does the brain collapse? The brain collapses because it cannot protect or process that information in that very time. So that's the first door. The brain protects itself from danger using 4 doors. I said the first one is by sleeping. That's why when you were children, back in the days, each and every time your mama would beat you up and all that, they would say, make sure you go and sleep. By the time you wake up, you've forgotten. By the time you wake up, you've forgotten. Why? Because when you close your eyes, we said 80% of the information we take into the brain go through the eyes, right? Now, when the eyes are closed, it means almost 80% of your brain is not working. Therefore, it becomes a little bit easier for you to live in that very environment. So the first door is by closing your eyes. Let's go to the second door. How does the brain protect you from danger? The danger is what you consider yourself to be. How does the brain distort reality from a real time experience? So the second door is what we call forgetting. That is the second door. Now the second door is when you experience something that is very dangerous, that you consider very dangerous, that you consider very painful as a human being, and it's very painful experience. In most cases, people choose to forget. That's why someone can say, because each and every time you remember what you experienced, the brain is going to receive it like it's happening right now. Or, let me give you an example. Have you ever met someone that hurt you 10 years ago? Right? When you meet that very person that hurt you 10 years ago, the brain is going to replay that very pain you felt 10 years ago. It doesn't forget. It doesn't forget, right? Now, the pain that you felt at that very time, you're going to experience it again. Let me give you a bad example. That's why it's very, very hard for someone to forget someone that made them lose their virginity. Because each and every time you meet that person, your brain is going to replay it like it was. That's why it's very, very, very hard. First of all, it is a pleasurable experience. 2, it's a painful experience. So each and every time you meet that person, your brain is going to replay it. And because your brain doesn't know what's right and wrong, your entire body is going to experience it like you're experiencing it in real time. So your body is going to have pain. Your body is going to have a lot of pain experiences. So the second door is by forgetting. So when you meet someone and they say, don't make me recall, don't take him into that lane. Why? Because there is a door that they've chosen to lock something inside. There is a door that they don't want open. There is a door that they are forcefully chosen to lock themselves in because they don't want to have that very experience in themselves or by their own experiences again, because they understand exactly how that pain was. In other words, what type of experience, what type of pain that they were in a position to experience. That's what we call the second door. So in most cases, when we experience something that's very detrimental, we choose to make ourselves forget. Why? Because each and every time we experience the same experience mentally, our brain does not tell the reality, does not know the difference between what happened back in the days and what is happening right now. Because the moment you recall a painful experience, you're going to feel, your brain is going to replay the same image. Your brain is going to replay the same occurrence. Your brain is going to have the same pain, like the pain you had that very time. So the second door is forgetting. We said the first door, we're talking about the doors or the ways the brain protects itself from the danger. Anything that's considered dangerous. And I said anything the brain considers dangerous can be as simple as reminding yourself or meeting someone that you hate, someone that hurt you in senior 1, someone that hurt you in senior 6, someone that took your money 5 years ago. The moment you meet them, your brain is going to bring back all the pain that you felt that very time when that person maybe got into something that was very treacherous, or someone disappointed you, or someone hurt you. You're going to feel that same pain. That's why people say Forgive but never forget. Because most especially when the experience was a little bit emotional, it's very, very hard for human beings to forget, most especially next experiences. Why is it that hard? Why is it hard for you to forget? Because the experience you get, the moment you experience it, your brain has to remind you. You know why? Such that next time that big experience comes, you are prepared. Such that that kind of experience becomes a little bit familiar. So the brain, like I've said, it protects itself from danger using 4 doors. The first door we talked about is closing your eyes. This can be consciousness. This can be collapsing. This can be fainting. That's the first door. The second door is forgetting, like trying to forget something. You can get yourself get into a forgetful mode such that you forget any kind of experience, most especially when that experience was very, very hurting. Now that's the second door. Now the third door is what we call madness. Now, there are so many people that you meet on the streets in Kampala and some most areas. They ran crazy. They got some kind of insanity. They got mad. Why? Not because they are bad people, but probably because they got into an interaction with some experience that they never knew how to process. Now, one time in 2014, we were carrying out a study with a colleague of ours, and he was telling us the first case he worked on. He was a cognitive scientist, and he was telling us of how the mind can be in a position to play. Now, this gentleman walked home, and he got, it was a very brutal experience. He walked back home. He was a married man. He walked back home, and he got his wife red-handed with a shamba boy, with a house helper. And this house helper was a boy. And he got them on the bed, in his bedroom, right? Now, when he interacted using the sight, of course, the eyes, whatever he saw, he got stuck. He couldn't even take the next step. After he realizing that his wife was sleeping with a helper, he couldn't process that kind of information. So the brain closes. It shuts down, by the way. Now, to the extent he couldn't even take the first step. He couldn't even take any step. By the way, most people die at that level. So when we're talking about this, it's not just a matter of entertainment. We need to know how these systems operate such that we can get to know how to react or how to act. So when this gentleman got to know that the shamba boy had slept with his wife and he was seeing them right on head, he couldn't process it because his identity was, this is my wife, this is my house, this is our bedroom, and this is our helper. In his experience mentally, he never had anyone called a maid or a house helper. That the house helper could go to a level of sleeping on their bed with his wife. Now, when he failed to process it mentally, because he couldn't have the right kind of experience, you know what happened? He ran crazy. Now, most of the people that you see on the streets of Kampala, yes, but they interact with a lot of experiences that they can't process. And the moment you interact with an experience you can't process, your brain is going to go into what we call madness. Now, madness at different levels. The first level of madness is what we call cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is like, nenze ndi mugezi. Lwaki gundi gwensinga amagezi ansinga sente? Aho no bamukazoli oba ogweddalu goba tomanyi. You know, you see like oyo mwana musinga obukulu. Lwaki yansinga sente? Oyo mwana musinga okutegeera. Lwaki yali bwati nga siri bwenti? Now that's your brain, by the way. Because it feels that the other person has a better, you have more experience, right? Because your brain cannot process exactly why that person is performing better than you. So it is going to go into what you call a cognitive dissonance. You're going to get into an accident with the reality that you're experiencing. If you process it and get out of it, that will be okay. The cognitive dissonance will become, you get into what you call a cognitive congress. Congress is when your belief system and your perception and your cognitive ability is the same. It is at parity, right? But if you fail, you're going to remain into what you call a cognitive dissonance. Back in the days when you were at school, we could be like, now you're man at Asoma, but they perform better than us. There are those students that would not read any time, but they would perform better than the students that are always reading and reading and reading. And you'll be like, So the moment you put yourself into comparison, that is what we call a cognitive dissonance. Now, if you deal with it well, definitely your brain is going to have a way of functioning or operating in a way that's going to help you. But if you fail to have a better way of dealing with it at personal level, you're going to get into a very, very bad experience. You can even get mad. Ogenda kugwa kwa accident na mazima. That is what we call cognitive dissonance. But all that is happening in the mind. All that is happening in the mind. So all these are mind games. This is what we define as the mindset. And then that is the third door. So the first door we say it is by sleeping or closing the eyes. And that means a lot, by the way, like I've explained. The second door is what we would call forgetting. Forgetting is how the brain protects itself from danger as well. And then the third door is what we call cognitive dissonance or getting mad. Getting mad. And I've said most of the people that you see on the streets of Kampala moving up and down, it's because they couldn't believe the interactions. It's because of the betrayal. You really couldn't believe that maybe your husband could betray you to that level. Maybe your house girl could not betray you to that level. Maybe your boss, you thought that your boss or your son or your daughter could not betray you at that very level. So you fail to process it very right. So the brain is going to get, your mind is going to drive you crazy. It's going to drive you crazy. And if you don't get good support, if you don't get the most appropriate support that can help you stabilize and process that information well, you can go to the, you can get to the level of getting what you call cognitive dissonance, or you can get into what you call madness. Now that is the third door. So sleeping, forgetfulness, and then madness. We say there are 4 doors. What is the fourth door? The fourth door is what you call death. Now, this is a little bit controversial. Most people die in hospitals because they are not supposed to die, but because they have failed to process information right. Now, most of the cases that so many people die of, it's because of their failure, because of the brain, because of the failure of the brain to process information. I'll give you an example. There is an accident that we are studying about, and this accident occurred somewhere, right? The entire family was driving somewhere. I think it was around Masaka Road. They were driving somewhere around Chengela or past Chengela, around Maya, I guess. As they were cruising that side, everyone in the car crashed. The car crashed into a trailer that was taking electric poles, you know, back in the days when I was still using electric poles. And actually they were driving, I think they were traveling to a wedding to Lukaya, right? But when they were getting involved in this car, when they were getting into this car, their aunt said, you go, I am going to use public means, because the car was full, right? Now, the first car that went, that had all the relatives and everyone, it hit around Maya, and everyone died. Like crushed, died. Some of them got out of the car, others got squeezed inside. Like it was a very terrible experience. I'm sorry to give you this example on a Sunday, right? After like 30 minutes, the auntie that had used the public means came and realized that there was an accident. She came over and she got to know that the family members she was with in the last 30 minutes, all of them had perished. It only took 15 seconds for the aunt to collapse as well. And when the aunt collapsed, she didn't come back again. She died. Now, this death comes in a way that's a little bit very controversial. She couldn't process the information rightly, that the people I was with are the people that have just perished in just a no time, and without any kind of explanation. Because the brain could not process it very well, she decided that the brain should shut down. Most people that die in such occurrences, it's because of that. That's why even when we are putting up some message to all the people, like maybe someone has passed on, you don't just come and go, hey, man, yeah, maka food day. No, you don't just yap just like that. You come and prepare them. You inaugurate them. You prepare them for something bad. You don't just come and hit the reality with them. Not so many people have the mental structure or the mental strength that can help them process that information. Most of the people that can't process that information positively, they don't survive. They die. Let me tell you something. There are so many people that have died because they have received the news of losing their beloved ones. So the moment you share out that so and so has passed out, the moment you start crying, this other person starts processing information. Okay, maybe it's a wife, she has lost the husband. Maybe it's a husband, he has lost a wife. It's like, what? My wife has just passed on. If the brain cannot process out very well to help them understand exactly how everything has taken place and help them collect themselves and collect all their resources to get back to how they are supposed to operate in the normal way, the brain is going to close the last door. And the last door is death. And this one is there's no returning back. There's no returning back. So like I've said, we are talking about the interactions. I said we are going to do like 7 classes about the mindset. When someone talks about the mindset, it's not just something that's very simple. It is a composition of so many aspects. So for us, we decided to get a little bit scientific, such that we can have a serious understanding of what it means to have a strong mindset. That's why we say that this is about the myth and misconceptions of what we call the mindset. So today, I'll just focusing on how the mind protects itself from danger. And I've said it starts with closing what we call the first door. Closing the first door is when you close your eyes. It closes the first door by sleeping or by the closing of the eyes. This can be sleeping, actual sleeping. This can be collapsing. This can be fainting. Now, when the person experiences this, in most cases, they come back. They regain their consciousness after some time. That's the first door. The second door, like I've said, the second door, the brain protects itself from danger. The second door is what we call forgetting. You go into an experience that's very painful, that hurts, that you don't want to recall, that you don't want to pick up again. The second door is what the brain closes. We call that forgetting. You force yourself to forget. You force yourself to forget that experience because of the pain it brings in back. Remember I said your brain does not know whether you're experiencing something in the real time or you're experiencing something that happened to you 10 years ago. That's why I said as you're taking a walk along Kampala Road and you meet your enemy, someone you hated 5 years ago, your brain is going to experience it like that is the enemy. You're hating them right now in that very time. That's the second door. We call it forgetting. The third door, we call it cognitive dissonance or getting mad. Most of the people that can't distort, that can't process the reality, that can't break it down, they choose to distort it by getting mad. For instance, getting betrayed. For instance, meeting your husband cheating on you on a real time, getting your wife cheating on you, or seeing someone killing a baby. That's why even in the movies, I don't know if you realize, when a killer comes around in a movie, when they are going to shoot someone, and then a baby comes around, they either shoot that person and shoot the baby as well, or the mission doesn't get executed. Because this kid, whatever they see, because their brain is still growing, they don't get into a level of forgetting that, right? That's why it is very, very dangerous. So the third door, we say that is what we call getting mad or getting into cognitive dissonance. And then the last door, we say that when the mind fails to process exactly what it has been processing to ensure that it picks up the reality from the reality it is experiencing, it chooses to close the door by making that person dead. Most people don't die because they are supposed to die. They die because their brain cannot process. Now, we shall be in position next Sunday to come back and explore and expound more on the 4 doors the brain uses to to protect itself from dangerous experiences. You're still watching TV1. This is Vision Voice, Dr. Semawo Charles Cake. We say that these are series. We are going to have a series of programs where we talk about the myth and misconceptions of the mindset. Vision Voice happens every Sunday from 1 to 2. We do career development, professional development, personal development, such that we can get to understand exactly how do we interact as human beings. Yes, that has been it for today. If you have any kind of interactions, you can hit up on our YouTube channel. The channel is called TV1 Uganda. If you're watching this show for the first time, there are many other shows that we've done in relation to what we're talking about right here. You can go back and catch so that you can be in position to join us and be in sync, such that we can move forward. Now we are coming back again with another program, and then at 3 to 4, we shall come up with a program called, what? Green Go Green campaign, a Go Green campaign. It runs from 3 to 4. It's about environmental conservation, climate change. Here it's hosted by Chantal from 3 to 4. And then from 4 to 6, we shall have Grand Abot Zulu the West in Sankofa Square, Ashe. So see you next Sunday as we shall continue with the definitions of the mindset. Thank you so much. You're still watching TV1. See the difference.